The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood quietly by the tall windows of her private sitting room. Her fingers traced the edge of a handwritten letter that had arrived just 3 days earlier. The paper felt heavy in her hands, not because of its weight, but because of the words it contained. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, an 89-year-old woman from a small village in Yorkshire, had written to express her deep gratitude for the royal couple's work with elderly care initiatives. What made this letter different from the hundreds of others that arrived each week was a simple line near the end. "Your Royal Highness, I fear this may be my last letter to you, as the doctors have given me only weeks to live." Catherine had read those words over and over again, each time feeling a deeper pull in her heart. Eleanor had been writing to the royal family for over 30 years, always sharing stories of her late husband's military service and her volunteer work at the local hospital. Her letters were never asking for anything, just sharing pieces of her life with genuine warmth and kindness. The princess knew that Eleanor represented thousands of people across the United Kingdom who felt a personal connection to the royal family, people who saw them not just as distant figures, but as part of their extended family. Prince William entered the room quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. He noticed immediately that his wife was holding Eleanor's letter again. Over the past few days, Catherine had mentioned the elderly woman several times, always with the same thoughtful expression she wore now. William set down the teacups and moved to stand beside his wife, looking out at the gardens where their children often played. "She's been on your mind again," William said gently, not needing to ask who Catherine was thinking about. His voice carried the understanding that came from years of marriage and shared public service. He had learned to recognize the moments when his wife was processing something particularly meaningful, when her natural empathy was working through a situation that touched her deeply. Catherine nodded slowly, finally, looking up at her husband. "I keep thinking about all the people like Eleanor, William, people who have supported us for decades, who write letters and send cards, who stand in the rain just to wave at us during visits. We see them for brief moments, but they carry us in their hearts for years." Her voice was soft but filled with conviction. "Eleanor has been writing to your grandmother, to your father, to us for 30 years. 30 years of sharing her life, her hopes, her memories. And now," William understood immediately. His wife's compassion had always been one of the qualities he admired most about her, but it also meant she felt deeply the responsibility that came with their roles. Every letter, every encounter, every person who reached out to them represented a trust that Catherine took seriously. She never saw their public service as merely ceremonial. To her, it was about real connections with real people who looked to the royal family for comfort, inspiration, and continuity. "What are you thinking?" William asked, though he suspected he already knew. He had seen that look in Catherine's eyes before, usually just before she proposed something that would surprise their staff, but would ultimately prove to be exactly the right thing to do. Catherine turned away from the window and faced her husband fully. "I'm thinking we should go see her." The words hung in the air between them, simple yet profound in their implications. Not as an official engagement, not with photographers and security details and formal protocols, just as people, as the family she's been writing to all these years. William was quiet for a moment, considering the logistics and the precedent such a visit would set. Royal protocol existed for good reasons, and private visits were carefully managed affairs. But as he looked at his wife's face, he saw something that reminded him why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. Catherine never let protocol override humanity, never allowed the formal aspects of their roles to prevent them from doing what felt right in their hearts. "The village is called Thornbury," Catherine continued, her mind already working through the details. "It's about 4 hours north of here, a small farming community. Eleanor lives in a cottage that belonged to her grandmother. She mentions it often in her letters, how she tends to the garden her husband planted before he died, how she still bakes bread for her neighbors every Tuesday." Catherine's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "She's been part of our lives for so long, William, through letters and prayers and faithful support. She's facing the end of her life, and she's alone except for a few neighbors and a visiting nurse. William set down his teacup and moved closer to his wife. You want to go and say goodbye properly? It wasn't a question. He knew Catherine well enough to understand exactly what she was proposing. The idea was both simple and revolutionary. Royal visits were planned months in advance, with detailed schedules and specific purposes. But sometimes the most meaningful gestures were the ones that broke from tradition. I want to thank her, Catherine said firmly. I want her to know that her letters mattered, that her support meant something real to us. I want her to see that the family she's been writing to for 30 years actually knows who she is, actually cares about her as a person. Catherine's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Everyone should have someone to say goodbye to them properly, William. Everyone should know they mattered. The Prince of Wales felt a familiar surge of pride in his wife. This was the woman who had won over not just him, but an entire nation, not through grand gestures or perfect speeches, but through moments like this. Moments when her heart simply wouldn't allow her to do anything other than what was right and kind and human. It would have to be very quiet, William said, already beginning to plan. A small security detail, no press, no fanfare. We need to coordinate with the local police, but we could keep it minimal. He was thinking aloud now, working through the practical considerations. We could drive ourselves, take the back roads. Make it feel as normal as possible. Catherine's face lit up with relief and gratitude. She had hoped William would understand, but she had also been prepared to make the case more forcefully if needed. The fact that he immediately began planning rather than listing obstacles told her everything she needed to know about why she had married this man. I'll call Eleanor's neighbor, Mrs. Hartwell, Catherine said, referring to the woman who had actually written the original letter on Eleanor's behalf, explaining about the older woman's declining health. She included her phone number in case we wanted to send a formal response. I'll ask her not to tell Eleanor we're coming. I want it to be a surprise. Over the next hour, the couple worked together to plan what would become one of the most talked about royal visits in recent memory, though neither of them knew that at the time. They were simply two people who had received a letter from someone who had been kind to them for decades, and they wanted to return that kindness in her final days. William contacted their security detail personally, explaining the situation to Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell, who had been with their protection team for 5 years. Sarah was known for her discretion and her ability to arrange security that was thorough but unobtrusive. She listened to the prince's request with professional calm, though privately she was touched by the motivation behind this unusual visit. We'll need a small advance team to assess the cottage and the surrounding area, Sarah explained during their phone conversation. But I think we can do this with minimal disruption. The village is small enough that we can coordinate easily with local authorities, and if we time it right, we can be in and out without drawing much attention. Meanwhile, Catherine called Mrs. Hartwell, Eleanor's neighbor, and the woman who had sent the original letter. The conversation was delicate. Catherine needed to explain who she was and what she wanted to do without causing alarm or creating a situation that might overwhelm the elderly woman they were hoping to visit. Mrs. Hartwell, this is Catherine, the Princess of Wales, she began, knowing how strange those words must sound coming through a phone line to a small village cottage. I received your letter about Mrs. Thompson, and I wondered if I might speak with you about a small favor. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Catherine began to worry they had been disconnected. Finally, Mrs. Hartwell's voice came through, shaky with disbelief. Your Royal Highness? Is this really... are you actually... Yes, it's really me, Catherine said gently, with the warm laugh that had become her trademark. And please call me Catherine. I'm calling because my husband and I've been deeply moved by Mrs. Thompson's letters over the years, and we understand she's facing a difficult time right now. As Catherine explained their wish to visit Eleanor privately, she could hear Mrs. Hartwell beginning to cry softly on the other end of the line. The neighbor explained that Eleanor had been declining rapidly over the past week, spending most of her time in bed, but still asking about the royal family every day, still wondering if her final letter had reached them. She talks about Prince William and you as if you were her own grandchildren, Mrs. Hartwell said through her tears. She has every newspaper clipping about your weddings, your children, your charitable work. Her cottage is like a museum of royal family moments, but not in a strange way, if you understand what I mean. More like proud family photographs. Catherine felt her own tears threatening as she listened. This was exactly what she had imagined, and exactly why this visit felt so important. Eleanor wasn't just a fan or a curious observer. She was someone who had invested emotionally in their lives, someone who had celebrated their joys and worried through their challenges as if they were her own family. Would it be possible for us to visit tomorrow afternoon? Catherine asked. We would come very quietly, with minimal security, just to spend a few minutes with her. I don't want to overwhelm her or tire her too much. Mrs. Hartwell's voice was stronger now, filled with purpose. Oh, my dear, she would be over the moon. But let me warn you, she's very weak now, and sometimes she gets confused about time and place. The medication makes her drowsy, and she doesn't always recognize people immediately. That's perfectly fine, Catherine assured her. We just want her to know she's been important to us, that her kindness has meant something real, even if she's not at her best, even if the visit is brief. After ending the call, Catherine and William spent the rest of the evening making final arrangements. They decided to drive themselves in William's personal car, a decision that raised some eyebrows among their security team, but which felt important to both of them. This wasn't a state visit or an official engagement. It was a personal gesture, and it should feel personal in every detail. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for a drive through the English countryside. Catherine chose a simple blue dress, one of her favorites for informal occasions, and William wore a casual blazer with no tie. They looked like any well-dressed couple heading out for a country visit, which was exactly the impression they hoped to create. As they loaded small gifts into the car, flowers from their own garden, a selection of photographs of their children that Catherine thought Eleanor might enjoy, and a handwritten letter of thanks, Catherine felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. She had met thousands of people in her years as a working royal, but somehow this felt different, more personal, more important. Are you ready? William asked as he started the car. Catherine looked back at Windsor Castle, then ahead toward the road that would take them north to Yorkshire, to a small cottage where an elderly woman was spending what might be her final days thinking about the royal family she had loved from afar for 30 years. Yes, she said softly, I'm ready. As they drove away from the castle grounds, neither Catherine nor William could have predicted that their simple gesture of kindness would touch hearts around the world, or that Eleanor Thompson's story would remind people everywhere of the power of human connection and the importance of saying goodbye properly to those who matter to us. The journey had begun not just across the English countryside, but toward a moment that would define what it truly means to serve with both duty and heart. The drive through the English countryside gave William and Catherine time to talk quietly about what they hoped to accomplish during their visit. As they passed through small villages and rolling green hills, Catherine found herself thinking about all the letters Eleanor had written over the years. Many of them were stored in the royal correspondence files, but Catherine had asked to see several of them the night before their journey. Each letter revealed a woman who had lived through tremendous changes in British society. Eleanor had written about rationing during the war years, about celebrating the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, about watching the royal weddings on television, and feeling as proud as if her own children were getting married. Her letters were never long or demanding. They were simply the thoughts of someone who felt connected to the continuity and tradition that the royal family represented. Listen to this one. Catherine had said to William the previous evening, reading from a letter Eleanor had sent after Prince George's birth. She writes, Your Royal Highness, I wanted to tell you how my heart soared when I heard the news of your son's arrival. I remember when Prince William was born, and now to see him become a father himself fills me with such joy. I have no grandchildren of my own, so I hope you don't mind that I think of your little ones as part of my extended family. I've knitted a small blanket in blue and white. Nothing fancy, just something made with love. Please give Prince George a kiss from an old lady in Yorkshire who has been watching over your family for more years than I care to count." William had been quiet after hearing that letter, understanding even more deeply why Catherine felt this visit was so important. Eleanor represented thousands of people across the Commonwealth who felt a genuine personal connection to the royal family, people for whom royal births and marriages and milestones were causes for celebration in their own lives. Now, as they drove north toward Yorkshire, both William and Catherine felt the weight of responsibility that came with their roles. But it was a good weight, one that reminded them why their work mattered beyond the ceremonies and official functions. They were custodians of something larger than themselves, something that brought comfort and continuity to people like Eleanor, who had lived through decades of change while holding onto the traditions that anchored them. The countryside gradually changed as they drove north, becoming more rugged and wild. Stone walls replaced wooden fences, and the villages grew smaller and more weathered. This was a part of England that relied on farming and tradition, where families often stayed for generations, and where the local pub was still the center of community life. Mrs. Hartwell said Eleanor's cottage is just past the church, Catherine said, consulting the directions they had been given. "It's the one with the blue gate, and the roses climbing over the door." She paused, looking out the landscape. She also mentioned that Eleanor might be having a difficult day today. Apparently, she didn't sleep well last night and was quite confused this morning. William nodded, understanding that their visit might need to be shorter than they had hoped. The important thing wasn't the length of time they spent with Eleanor, but simply that she knew they had come, that her years of faithful correspondence had been appreciated by the family she had written to with such dedication. As they entered the village of Thornbury, Catherine felt her heart begin to beat faster. The village was exactly as she had imagined from Eleanor's letters. A single main street with a small shop, a pub called the Crown and Anchor, and a beautiful stone church surrounded by ancient yew trees. Everything looked well-maintained but quietly weathered, the kind of place where change came slowly and traditions ran deep. They found Eleanor's cottage easily, recognizing it immediately from the description Mrs. Hartwell had provided. The blue gate was slightly faded but freshly painted, and roses were indeed climbing over the front door, heavy with blooms despite the late season. The cottage itself was small but perfectly maintained, with a neat garden that showed signs of loving care even though Eleanor was no longer able to tend it herself. William parked the car on the quiet street, and they sat for a moment gathering their thoughts. Their security detail had arrived an hour earlier and was positioned discreetly around the village, but the overall feeling was peaceful rather than tense. Detective Inspector Mitchell had done her job well, ensuring their safety without disrupting the quiet rhythm of village life. Catherine picked up the flowers they had brought and the small wrapped gifts, while William gathered the folder of photographs they had selected for Eleanor. As they walked up the narrow path to the front door, Catherine noticed details that Eleanor had mentioned in her letters: the herb garden with rosemary and thyme, the small greenhouse where she had grown tomatoes, the bird feeder that attracted the robins she loved to watch. Mrs. Hartwell answered the door before they could knock, clearly having been watching for their arrival. She was a woman in her 70s with silver hair and kind eyes that were bright with tears. She had dressed carefully for their visit in a navy blue dress with a small brooch, and Catherine immediately understood that this moment was as meaningful for the neighbor as it was for Eleanor. "Your Royal Highnesses," Mrs. Hartwell said softly, dropping into a small curtsy. "I can't believe you're actually here." Eleanor is awake and having a good moment, though she's still quite weak. Catherine stepped forward and took Mrs. Hartwell's hands gently. "Please call us William and Catherine today. We're here as friends, not as royals. How is Eleanor doing this afternoon?" Mrs. Hartwell's eyes filled with tears again. "She's in her sitting room, by the window where she likes to watch the birds. I told her some special visitors were coming, but I didn't say who. I thought it would be better coming from you." She paused, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. She's been asking about the royal family all morning, wondering if anyone received her last letter. She'll be so happy. The cottage was exactly as Catherine had imagined, small and cozy, filled with the accumulation of a long life lived in one place. But what struck her immediately was how much of that life had been intertwined with the royal family. Photographs lined the mantelpiece and covered small tables. Pictures of royal weddings, christenings, state occasions, and informal family moments that had been published over the years. It wasn't the collection of an obsessive fan, but rather the careful curation of someone who had followed a family story with genuine affection. Mrs. Hartwell led them through a narrow hallway lined with more photographs and into a bright sitting room where Eleanor Thompson sat in a comfortable chair by the window. Catherine's breath caught slightly when she saw the elderly woman. Eleanor was clearly very frail, thin, and pale with white hair that was carefully brushed but sparse. She was wearing a lavender cardigan over a white blouse, and, despite her obvious illness, she had clearly made an effort with her appearance. But what struck Catherine most was Eleanor's face. Even weakened by illness, it showed the intelligence and kindness that had come through so clearly in her letters. Her eyes, though tired, were alert and focused on the doorway where Catherine and William stood. "Eleanor, dear," Mrs. Hartwell said gently, "your visitors have arrived." Eleanor looked up at them with curiosity, and Catherine could see the moment when recognition dawned. The elderly woman's eyes widened, and her hand went to her heart. For a moment, Catherine worried that the shock might be too much, but then Eleanor's face broke into a smile of such pure joy that it took Catherine's breath away. "It can't be," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "It can't possibly be. Catherine, Prince William." She tried to rise from her chair, but her strength wasn't sufficient. William stepped forward quickly, his voice gentle and warm. "Please don't get up, Mrs. Thompson. We've come to visit you." He knelt beside her chair so that he was at her eye level. "We received your letters, and we wanted to thank you personally for all your kindness over the years." Catherine moved to Eleanor's other side, taking the elderly woman's hand in both of hers. Eleanor's hand was paper-thin and cold, but she gripped Catherine's fingers with surprising strength. "We've been reading your letters for years," Catherine said softly. "Every single one has meant something to us. You've shared your life with us, and we wanted to share ours with you." Eleanor began to cry then, not with sadness, but with overwhelming joy and disbelief. "I can't believe you're really here," she kept repeating. "In my little cottage. I dreamed about this, especially after the doctors told me, but I never imagined." "We're here," William said simply. "We're really here, and we're so glad to meet you properly at last." For the next hour, they sat with Eleanor in her comfortable sitting room while she shared stories and memories that went far beyond anything she had written in her letters. She told them about watching Prince Charles and Princess Diana's wedding with all her neighbors crowded into her cottage because she had the only color television on the street. She described listening to the radio coverage of Queen Elizabeth's coronation while she helped her mother prepare tea for the village celebration. "I've written to your grandmother so many times," Eleanor told William, her voice growing stronger as she became more comfortable. "When she was just a young princess, then through all the years of her reign. She sent me a lovely response once, when I wrote after your grandfather died. Just a simple note, but it meant everything to me." Catherine was struck by how Eleanor spoke about the royal family, not with the distance of a subject speaking about monarchs, but with the warmth of someone discussing relatives she cared about deeply. It was clear that these relationships, one-sided though they might have been, had provided structure and meaning to Eleanor's life over many decades. "I want you to see something," Eleanor said suddenly, gesturing toward a wooden chest by the window. Mrs. Hartwell moved to help her, and together they opened the chest to reveal dozens of letters and cards, all carefully preserved and organized chronologically. "Every response I've received over the years," Eleanor explained proudly. "From Christmas cards to formal acknowledgments to that special note from your grandmother. I've kept them all." William and Catherine exchanged glances, both deeply moved by this tangible evidence of Eleanor's devotion. These weren't just letters to her. They were treasures, proof of a connection that had sustained her through lonely times and difficult periods. Mrs. Thompson, Catherine said gently, "We brought some things we thought you might enjoy." She presented the flowers first, beautiful roses and peonies from the gardens at Windsor Castle. Eleanor's eyes widened when Catherine explained where they had come from. "From your own garden?" Eleanor whispered, holding the flowers close to her face to breathe in their scent. "I can't believe it. Flowers from the castle gardens, here in my little cottage." Next, William showed her the folder of family photographs, including recent pictures of Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis that had never been published. Eleanor studied each picture carefully, commenting on how much the children had grown and how happy they all looked. "They're beautiful children," she said softly, touching the edge of one photograph. "You must be so proud. I think about them often, wondering what they're learning, what games they like to play. In my letters, I sometimes pretend I'm writing to my own grandchildren." Catherine felt her throat tighten at those words. Here was a woman who had never had children of her own, who had lived her entire adult life in this small cottage, but who had found family in the most unexpected place, through letters and photographs and the distant but real connection she felt with the royal family. As the afternoon progressed, Eleanor grew visibly tired, but she fought against the exhaustion, clearly wanting to extend this miraculous visit for as long as possible. Catherine and William were sensitive to her condition, keeping their voices gentle and allowing for comfortable silences when Eleanor needed to rest. "I have something for you as well," Eleanor said suddenly, rallying her energy one more time. She asked Mrs. Hartwell to bring her knitting basket, and from it she pulled a small, beautifully crafted baby blanket in soft yellow wool. "I started this when I heard Princess Charlotte was expected," she explained, her voice proud despite her weakness. "I know it's years too late now, but I kept working on it. I suppose I was hoping it might reach you somehow." Catherine accepted the blanket with reverence, running her fingers over the intricate pattern. The stitches were tiny and perfect, clearly the work of someone who had spent years perfecting her craft. "Eleanor, this is beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. I will treasure it always. It's made with love," Eleanor said simply. "Everything I've ever made for your family has been made with love." As shadows began to lengthen in the cottage, both William and Catherine knew their visit would need to end soon. Eleanor was fighting to stay alert, but they could see how much the excitement and effort of the afternoon had cost her. Still, neither wanted to be the first to suggest leaving. This moment felt too precious, too rare to cut short. Eleanor seemed to sense their reluctance to go, and she reached out to take both of their hands. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear despite her exhaustion. "Thank you for coming, for making an old woman's dream come true. I never expected anything like this when I wrote that last letter. I wanted you to know that you've been loved." Catherine leaned forward and kissed Eleanor's forehead gently. "You've been loved too, Mrs. Thompson. More than you know. Your letters have brought us joy for years, and meeting you today has been one of the most special experiences of our lives." William stood and placed his hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "We'll never forget this afternoon, Mrs. Thompson. Thank you for welcoming us into your home, and thank you for all the years of kindness you've shown our family." As they prepared to leave, Eleanor insisted on walking them to the door despite her weakness. She leaned heavily on Mrs. Hartwell's arm, but she was determined to see them off properly. At the doorway, she stopped and looked up at both of them with clear, bright eyes. "Take care of each other," she said softly, "and take care of those beautiful children. The world needs more love like yours." With those words echoing in their hearts, William and Catherine walked back to their car, carrying with them an experience that would change how they thought about their roles and their responsibilities. Behind them, Eleanor stood in her doorway until their car disappeared around the corner, then allowed Mrs. Hartwell to help her back inside to rest. Neither Eleanor nor the royal couple could have predicted how this simple afternoon would soon touch hearts around the world, or how Eleanor's story would remind people everywhere of the power of faithful love and the importance of human connection across all boundaries of status and circumstance. The drive back to Windsor Castle was mostly silent, both William and Catherine lost in their own thoughts about the remarkable afternoon they had just shared with Eleanor Thompson. As the Yorkshire countryside gave way to more familiar southern landscapes, Catherine found herself looking at the baby blanket Eleanor had given her, marveling at the tiny, perfect stitches that represented hours of careful work and boundless love. "She was exactly as I imagined," Catherine said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "Kind, thoughtful, genuine. But seeing her in person, seeing how frail she is, and yet how bright her spirit remains." Her voice trailed off, unable to fully express the emotions the visit had stirred in her. William nodded, understanding completely. The way she spoke about our family, about grandmother, about the children, it wasn't the admiration of a distant observer. She spoke like someone who had been personally invested in our lives for decades. He paused, thinking about Eleanor's collection of letters and photographs, the careful way she had preserved every small connection with the royal family. "We're part of her family story, Catherine. Maybe the most important part." As they drove through the gathering dusk, both were aware that their visit with Eleanor would likely be one of their last conversations with her. The elderly woman's health was clearly declining rapidly, and the effort of their visit, joyful though it had been, had obviously exhausted her. But rather than feeling sad about this reality, both William and Catherine felt grateful that they had been able to give Eleanor this gift of recognition and personal connection in her final days. What they didn't know was that their visit had already begun to create ripples that would extend far beyond Eleanor's small cottage. Mrs. Hartwell, deeply moved by what she had witnessed, had called her daughter that evening to share the story of the royal visit. Her daughter, a teacher in Manchester, mentioned it to her husband, who worked for the local newspaper. By the next morning, word had quietly begun to spread through the region that the Prince and Princess of Wales had made an unscheduled, private visit to an elderly woman in Yorkshire. The story might have remained a local curiosity, but 2 days after the visit, Mrs. Hartwell received a call from Eleanor's doctor, Dr. Patricia Hayes, who had been treating Eleanor for several months. The elderly woman had been telling everyone at the medical practice about her royal visitors, and Dr. Hayes wanted to confirm that Eleanor wasn't experiencing confusion or delusions related to her medication. Mrs. Hartwell assured the doctor that the visit had indeed taken place, and Dr. Hayes was amazed. She had been working with terminally ill patients for over 20 years, and she had never seen such a dramatic improvement in a patient's spirits. Eleanor, who had been withdrawn and depressed for weeks, was now alert, engaged, and eager to share her story with anyone who would listen. "The change in her is remarkable," Dr. Hayes told Mrs. Hartwell. "Her physical condition remains serious, but psychologically and emotionally, it's as if someone has given her a new lease on life. She's asking for more time sitting up, she's eating better, and she's talking about writing one more letter to thank their Royal Highnesses properly." Word of Eleanor's transformation and the story behind it gradually reached other medical professionals in the area, then spread to local clergy, community leaders, and eventually to regional media outlets. The story that emerged wasn't just about a royal visit, but about the profound impact that human kindness and recognition could have on someone facing the end of their life. Meanwhile, back at Windsor Castle, Catherine and William had shared the story of their visit with their children in age-appropriate terms. Prince George, now old enough to understand the significance of their role, was particularly interested in Eleanor's letters and the idea that someone they had never met could care about their family so deeply. "Can we write to her?" George asked his mother one evening as they were discussing the visit. "I want to tell her thank you for the blanket and for writing to us all those years." Catherine's heart swelled with pride at her son's instinct for kindness. "That's a wonderful idea, George. What would you like to say to her?" Together, they crafted a simple letter from George to Eleanor, with Princess Charlotte adding her name and Prince Louis contributing a small drawing. The letter was informal and sweet, exactly what might be expected from a young boy writing to an elderly friend of the family. "Dear Mrs. Thompson," George dictated while Catherine wrote. Thank you for writing to our family for so many years and for making the beautiful blanket for our family. Mama told me how kind you are and how much you care about us. I hope you're feeling well and that you have a nice day. Love from George, Charlotte, and Louis. Catherine added a personal note explaining that George had insisted on writing to Eleanor himself, and that all three children had been touched by the story of her faithful correspondence over the years. The letter was posted the next day, along with a photograph of the three children that had been taken in the Windsor Castle Gardens. Eleanor received the letter 4 days later, during what would prove to be one of her final good days. Mrs. Hartwell found her sitting in her chair by the window, holding the letter and crying tears of pure joy. Eleanor asked her neighbor to read the letter aloud 3 times, each time marveling that Prince George had thought to write to her personally. "He's only 11 years old," Eleanor kept saying, "but he took the time to write to an old lady in Yorkshire. What kind and thoughtful parents he must have." She carefully placed the letter with her other royal correspondence, but kept the children's photograph on her bedside table where she could see it constantly. By this time, the story of the royal visit had begun to attract wider attention. A freelance journalist from London, visiting family in Yorkshire, heard the story at the local pub and was intrigued enough to investigate further. When she confirmed the basic facts and understood the human interest angle, she pitched the story to her editor and national newspaper. The challenge was how to tell the story respectfully, without invading Eleanor's privacy or sensationalizing what had been intended as a private gesture. The journalist, Sarah Mitchell, no relation to the Royal Protection Officer, approached Mrs. Hartwell carefully, explaining that she wanted to write about the visit only with the family's permission and only in a way that honored both Eleanor and the royal couple's intentions. Mrs. Hartwell discussed the request with Eleanor, who was initially hesitant about publicity, but gradually warmed to the idea when she understood that the story might inspire others to reach out to elderly or isolated people in their own communities. "If telling my story helps other lonely old people feel less forgotten," Eleanor said slowly, "then I suppose it would be worth sharing." The article that eventually appeared was masterfully written, focusing not on the details of the royal visit itself, but on the broader themes of human connection, the importance of faithful correspondence, and the way simple gestures of recognition could transform someone's final days. The journalist interviewed Dr. Hayes about the positive impact of meaningful social connections on terminal patients, spoke with village residents about Eleanor's character and community involvement, and included just enough detail about the royal visit to illustrate the power of taking time to acknowledge those who support us from afar. The response to the article was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of publication, the newspaper's website crashed from the volume of traffic. Social media exploded with people sharing their own stories of elderly relatives or neighbors who had followed the royal family faithfully, or who had written letters to public figures they admired but never expected to meet. More importantly, the story sparked a movement. Hashtags like #RememberEleanor and #WriteALetter began trending as people shared stories of forgotten correspondence and unacknowledged support. Community groups across the United Kingdom started programs to connect with elderly residents who might be spending their final years alone, inspired by Eleanor's story to reach out with personal visits and genuine conversation. The royal household, initially concerned about the publicity surrounding what had been intended as a private gesture, quickly realized that the story was having an entirely positive impact. Rather than focusing on celebrity or protocol, people were responding to the deeper message about human dignity and the importance of acknowledging those who support us quietly and faithfully. Prince Charles, now King Charles III, called his son to express his pride in the visit and its aftermath. "You and Catherine have reminded people what service really means," he told William. "It's not about the ceremonies or the formal engagements. It's about seeing people as individuals and responding to their humanity." Queen Camilla, who had followed the story closely, suggested that the royal family might formalize some system for recognizing long-term correspondence and faithful supporters. "Eleanor can't be the only person who has written faithfully for decades," she pointed out. Perhaps we should find ways to acknowledge others while they're still able to appreciate it. Back in Yorkshire, Eleanor was experiencing her 15 minutes of fame with grace and humor. She received hundreds of letters from people around the world who had been touched by her story. Children sent drawings, elderly people shared their own memories of following the royal family, and young mothers wrote to thank her for representing the generation of faithful supporters who had maintained continuity through decades of change. Mrs. Hartwell organized a system to help Eleanor read and appreciate as many letters as possible, but it quickly became clear that the volume was overwhelming for someone in Eleanor's condition. Instead, they created a system where Mrs. Hartwell would read several letters each day, choosing ones that seemed particularly meaningful or interesting. One letter that especially moved Eleanor came from a young mother in Australia whose grandmother had also been a faithful royal correspondent. Reading about your story made me realize that I never properly thanked my Nan for all the years she spent following the royal family and sharing that interest with me, the woman wrote. Because of your example, I called her yesterday and had the most wonderful conversation about her memories of royal visits to Australia. Thank you for reminding me to honor the people who have loved our family faithfully. Another letter came from a nursing home in Scotland, where residents had organized their own letter-writing campaign to the royal family, inspired by Eleanor's decades of correspondence. You've shown us that it's never too late to reach out, their letter stated, and that every person's support matters, no matter how small or distant it might seem. As Eleanor's story continued to spread, it began to influence how people thought about correspondence, recognition, and the relationship between public figures and their supporters. Schools started pen pal programs connecting young students with elderly residents in care homes. Charities reported increased volunteerism for programs serving isolated elderly people. Even businesses began reviewing their approach to customer correspondence, looking for ways to add more personal touches to their responses. The most touching response came from Buckingham Palace itself, where staff members who handled royal correspondence reported that Eleanor's story had given new meaning to their daily work. Reading and responding to the thousands of letters that arrived each week was no longer just administrative duty. It was recognition of the Eleanor Thompsons throughout the Commonwealth who found connection and meaning through their relationship with the royal family. Catherine, reading these reports a week after their visit, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. What had begun as a simple desire to thank someone for their faithful support had become a reminder to people everywhere about the power of reaching out, of acknowledging those who support us quietly, and of treating every human connection as meaningful and important. Eleanor Thompson, in her small cottage in Yorkshire, had become more than just a royal correspondent. She had become a symbol of faithful love, of the connections that bind communities together, and of the profound impact that recognition and kindness could have on anyone at any stage of life. But Eleanor's story was far from over, and the most meaningful chapter was yet to be written. 3 weeks after the royal visit, Eleanor Thompson's condition began to decline more rapidly. The burst of energy and joy that had sustained her following William and Catherine's visit gradually gave way to increasing weakness and longer periods of sleep. Mrs. Hartwell, now functioning as much more than a neighbor, arranged for round-the-clock nursing care and made sure Eleanor was never alone during what everyone understood would be her final days. Dr. Hayes visited daily, monitoring Eleanor's condition and ensuring her comfort. On what would prove to be Eleanor's last coherent day, the doctor found her patient sitting by the window in her favorite chair, wrapped in a soft blanket and holding the photograph of Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis that had accompanied their letter. "How are you feeling today, Eleanor?" Dr. Hayes asked gently, taking the chair beside her patient. Eleanor turned slowly, her eyes still bright, despite her obvious fatigue. "I'm ready, Dr. Hayes," she said quietly. "I've had the most wonderful life, and these past few weeks have been like a beautiful dream. I never imagined that my letters would lead to something so special." She gestured toward the dozens of cards and letters that covered every surface in her sitting room, responses to her story from people around the world. "Look at all this love," she said softly. People I've never met writing to tell me that my story touched their hearts. Children sending drawings, grandparents sharing their own memories. It's overwhelming. Dr. Hayes nodded, understanding the deep satisfaction in Eleanor's voice. In her years of working with terminal patients, she had learned to recognize the difference between those who died with regrets and unfinished business, and those who departed feeling complete and at peace. Eleanor clearly fell into the latter category. I want you to know, Eleanor continued, that these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. Not just because of the royal visit, though that was wonderful beyond words, but because of what came after. All these people reaching out, sharing their stories, connecting with each other because of something that happened in my little cottage. I feel like I've been part of something much bigger than myself. That afternoon, Eleanor asked Mrs. Hartwell to help her write one final letter. Her handwriting, once neat and precise, had become shaky and difficult to read, so she dictated while her neighbor wrote. To their Royal Highnesses, the Prince and Princess of Wales, Eleanor began, her voice growing stronger as she found the words she wanted to say. I am writing what I know will be my final letter to your family, and I want it to be one of gratitude rather than goodbye. She paused, gathering her thoughts, then continued. Your visit to my cottage 3 weeks ago was the greatest gift I could have imagined receiving in my lifetime. But what has happened since then has been even more meaningful. The story of our meeting has touched hearts around the world and reminded people of the importance of reaching out to one another, especially to those who might be forgotten or overlooked. Eleanor stopped dictating and asked Mrs. Hartwell to bring her the scrapbook where she had been keeping clippings about the response to her story. As she turned the pages, she smiled at the headlines. The power of a letter. How one woman's story inspired a movement. Royal visit sparks nationwide campaign to connect with elderly. Eleanor's legacy. Communities rally to honor faithful correspondence. Continue with the letter, please, Eleanor said, settling back in her chair. I have watched with wonder as my simple story has inspired people to write letters to their elderly neighbors, to visit nursing homes, to reach out to those who support them from afar. If my life has contributed in some small way to more kindness in the world, then I am deeply grateful. She paused again, looking out the window at the garden where roses were beginning their autumn decline. I want you to know that I'm not afraid of what comes next. I have lived a full life. I have loved and been loved, and I have had the extraordinary experience of connecting with your family across the years through letters and shared moments of joy. Most importantly, I have seen how one small gesture of kindness can ripple outward to touch thousands of lives. Eleanor's voice grew softer as she reached the end of her letter. Please give my love to Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. Tell them that an old lady in Yorkshire will always be watching over them, just as I have watched over your family for so many years. And thank you, both of you, for showing the world that true royalty lies not in crowns or ceremonies, but in a willingness to see and acknowledge the humanity in everyone. She ended the letter simply. With all my love and gratitude, Eleanor Thompson. Mrs. Hartwell mailed the letter that afternoon, along with a note from herself explaining Eleanor's declining condition and her desire to have the letter reach the royal couple before her death. The letter would arrive at Windsor Castle 2 days later, just hours after Eleanor's peaceful passing. Eleanor died on a quiet Tuesday morning, surrounded by the nurses who had cared for her and by Mrs. Hartwell, who held her hand as she slipped away in her sleep. Her final words, spoken the night before to Mrs. Hartwell, were simple and profound. Thank you for helping me share my story. I hope it helps people remember to be kind to each other. The news of Eleanor's death spread quickly through the village, and then beyond, carried by the many people who had followed her story over the past month. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The small village church where Eleanor had worshipped for over 60 years was flooded with flowers, cards, and messages from around the world. People who had never met Eleanor felt compelled to pay their respects to a woman who had become a symbol of faithful love and human connection. At Windsor Castle, Catherine was in her office when she received word of Eleanor's passing. She had been expecting the news, given what they knew about Eleanor's condition, but it still hit her with unexpected force. She sat quietly for several minutes, thinking about their afternoon in the small cottage, about Eleanor's joy and dignity, and about the letter that had started it all. William found her there an hour later, still holding Eleanor's final letter, which had arrived in that morning's post. Together, they read Eleanor's beautiful words about gratitude, connection, and the ripple effects of kindness. Neither spoke for a long time after finishing the letter. She understood something important, Catherine said finally, about how individual actions can create larger movements, about how personal connections can inspire broader change. Our visit wasn't just about acknowledging her. It became about acknowledging everyone like her. William nodded, thinking about the reports they had been receiving from around the Commonwealth about increased volunteerism with elderly populations, about nursing homes receiving more visits, and letters about communities organizing programs to honor their own long-term supporters and correspondents. "What should we do?" William asked. "About the funeral, I mean. We can't attend without turning it into a media circus, but we can't just ignore it either." Catherine had been thinking about this same question. Eleanor's funeral would be a small, village affair, and their presence would inevitably overwhelm what should be an intimate gathering for those who had known and loved her personally. But they felt a deep obligation to honor Eleanor's memory in some meaningful way. "I have an idea," Catherine said slowly. "What if we arrange for a private memorial service here at Windsor, just for the staff who work with royal correspondence, and perhaps some representatives from the charities Eleanor supported over the years? We could invite Mrs. Hartwell and Dr. Hayes and anyone else who was close to Eleanor personally." The idea grew as they discussed it. Rather than attending Eleanor's funeral and inevitably making about them, they would host a separate service that focused specifically on Eleanor's role as a faithful correspondent and the broader community of people like her who maintained connections with the royal family through letters and quiet support. Plans for Eleanor's memorial service at Windsor Castle were made with the same care and attention to detail that marked any royal event, but with a gentleness and intimacy that reflected the woman they were honoring. The service would be held in St. George's Chapel, but in one of the smaller side chapels that could accommodate about 50 people comfortably. Mrs. Hartwell was invited to give a brief eulogy about Eleanor's life and character. Dr. Hayes was asked to speak about the impact of human connection on health and well-being, using Eleanor's story as an example of how recognition and acknowledgement could transform someone's final days. Several representatives from charities that Eleanor had supported over the years were invited to share how her small donations and volunteer work had contributed to their missions. Most movingly, the memorial service included readings from some of Eleanor's letters spanning the 30 years she had been writing to the royal family. Catherine had selected excerpts that showed Eleanor's character, her wisdom, her humor, and her deep capacity for love and loyalty. The letters revealed not just Eleanor's devotion to the royal family, but her insight into human nature and her ability to find joy in simple pleasures. One letter, written after the birth of Prince William, included Eleanor's reflection on the continuity of family and tradition. Watching the joy on the Queen's face as she held her new grandson reminded me that some things never change, no matter how much the world shifts around us. Love between generations, the hope we place in our children, the desire to leave the world a little better than we found it. These are constants that connect us all. Another letter, sent during a particularly difficult period in royal family history, showed Eleanor's wisdom and compassion. "Your Royal Highness, I wanted you to know that in our village, as in villages across Britain, we understand that families go through difficult times. We continue to hold your family in our prayers, not because you are royalty, but because you are human beings facing challenges that touch all families in different ways." The memorial service was attended by people whose work had been touched by Eleanor's story. Staff members from the Royal Correspondence Office shared how her letters had influenced their approach to responding to the thousands of people who wrote to the royal family each year. Nursing home directors spoke about the increase in volunteers and visitors they had experienced since Eleanor's story became public. Most touchingly, several elderly people who had been inspired by Eleanor's example attended the service. These were people who had started writing their own letters to the royal family, or who had reached out to other public figures they admired, or who had simply begun corresponding with neighbors and distant relatives they had lost touch with over the years. Catherine and William both spoke at the service, sharing their memories of their visit with Eleanor and reflecting on the lessons her life had taught them about service, connection, and the power of acknowledging those who support us quietly and faithfully. Eleanor Thompson showed us that true service isn't about grand gestures or public recognition, Catherine said during her remarks. It's about consistent, faithful care for others, about maintaining connections across time and distance, about finding ways to express love and support even when you don't expect anything in return. She served our family for 30 years through her letters, her prayers, and her unwavering loyalty. In return, we had the privilege of serving her just once by acknowledging her importance in our lives. William spoke about the broader impact of Eleanor's story. Eleanor's death has not ended her influence. If anything, it has amplified her message about the importance of human connection and recognition. Every day, we hear from people who have reached out to elderly neighbors, who have started letter-writing campaigns, who have visited nursing homes or contacted distant relatives because Eleanor's story reminded them of the power we all have to make others feel valued and remembered. The service concluded with a moment of silence, not just for Eleanor, but for all the unsung supporters, faithful correspondents, and quiet servants who sustain communities and families through their persistent care and attention. As the congregation filed out of the chapel, many people lingered to share stories with Mrs. Hartwell about Eleanor's impact on their own understanding of service and connection. In the weeks following the memorial service, the Eleanor Thompson Foundation was established to support programs connecting young people with elderly residents in their communities. The foundation's mission statement read simply, to ensure that no one spends their final days feeling forgotten or unappreciated, and to honor the power of faithful correspondence and human connection across generations. Catherine and William became patrons of the foundation, but its actual work was carried out by community volunteers, healthcare professionals, and young people who had been inspired by Eleanor's story to reach out to elderly people in their own neighborhoods. Eleanor's cottage in Yorkshire became an unexpected pilgrimage site, with people traveling from across Britain and beyond to see the place where a simple gesture of royal recognition had sparked a movement of kindness. Mrs. Hartwell, now in her role as unofficial guardian of Eleanor's legacy, welcomed visitors and shared stories of her remarkable neighbor. The blue gate where Catherine and William had first entered Eleanor's world was preserved exactly as it had been, climbing roses and all. But Mrs. Hartwell added a small plaque beside the gate that read, Eleanor Thompson, 1934 to 2024. Faithful correspondent, beloved neighbor, inspiration for kindness. 1 year after Eleanor's death, Catherine and William returned to Thornbury for the anniversary of their original visit. This time, their visit was planned and public, but the focus remained on Eleanor's legacy rather than royal protocol. They visited the Eleanor Thompson Memorial Garden that had been created in the village, met with beneficiaries of programs inspired by her story, and participated in the annual letter-writing day that communities across the Commonwealth had adopted in Eleanor's honor. Standing once again by the cottage where their lives had intersected with Eleanor's, Catherine reflected on how one elderly woman's letters had taught them about the true meaning of their roles and responsibilities. Eleanor had shown them that service wasn't just about ceremonies and official engagements. It was about seeing and acknowledging the individual people who made up the communities they served. She's still teaching us, Catherine said to William as they prepared to leave Thornbury for the second time. Every letter we receive now, every person we meet, I think about Eleanor and remember that this isn't just duty or protocol. These are real people with real stories, and they deserve to be seen and appreciated as individuals. Eleanor Thompson had passed away peacefully in her small cottage, surrounded by love and recognition in her final weeks. But her influence continued to ripple outward, touching lives around the world and reminding people everywhere that faithful love, persistent kindness, and the simple act of reaching out to acknowledge others could create connections that transcended status, distance, and even death. In the end, Eleanor had gotten what she had always hoped for from her decades of correspondence with the royal family. Not recognition for herself, but the knowledge that love and kindness could travel across any distance and create lasting connections between hearts that might never otherwise have met. Her legacy lived on in every letter written, every elderly person visited, and every act of recognition that reminded someone they had not been forgotten. The farewell everyone felt wasn't just for Eleanor. It was a collective recognition of all the Eleanor Thompsons in our communities who serve faithfully, love persistently, and deserve to be acknowledged for the quiet ways they make the world more connected and kind.